The Rip is set, like The Body Surface and The Bay of Contented Men, my earlier books of stories, mostly on the Australian coast, mostly on the northern New South Wales coast, but also on the southwest coast of Western Australia and the Queensland coast. I find while I've written quite a few novels set, most of my novels are actually set in the inland somewhere. When I come to writing short stories, the coast always forces itself forward in my mind, and I think it's probably because there's something rather dramatic about it. It's in an instant, a rip can take you by the legs and change your life forever, especially if you're a tourist unused to the Australian surf. I like the idea of the rip as a metaphor because it's, apart from being a sudden occurrence that sweeps us off our feet, it's an event that drastically and instantly changes circumstances. And we've all had, by the time you get to middle age certainly, you've all had a few instances of those in your life. Either events that are totally out of your control to change or to affect. And I like the idea of that sort of conflict underlying these stories. I like writing novels, but in a way I prefer the short story. In its essence, it appeals to something basic in our natures. And I think that goes right back to the fireside tales of our ancestors. And a well-told story seems to speak to each of us personally. With a novel's like watching a long film, really. There's so many characters and so many scenes that it's sort of quite a diverse piece of literature. But apart from its sharper focus, what a good story has over the novel is it sets up a need in us we mightn't have even been aware of before we began to read it, and then somehow fulfills it. And if that works, as a writer, I regard that as a sort of small miracle. The Australian short story is actually thriving at the moment. There's a new book by Nam Lee, The Boat, which many of you might know. That's a particularly good collection. A writer called Kate Kennedy has a collection coming out next month that is really excellent, world class. And there's a young Queensland writer called Will Elliott, who I would also recommend to keen readers. Edgar Allan Poe, who's often thought of as the father of the short story, once simply defined it in the beginning as a narrative that can be read at one sitting. Now, I'd certainly say that each of these stories of mine can be read at one sitting, or in the case of In Bed at Night, one lying. And that's another good thing about the short story, is that you can... It's just long enough for you to read while you're still awake. If you're reading a novel in bed, you tend to forget, by the time the next night comes around, you tend to have forgotten where you were, and you've got to read back a page or two. With a short story, you read it, it's complete, it's satisfying, or not, but it's complete, and then you can go to sleep having been hopefully entertained. Anyway, I'd like to read one of the lighter, perhaps, stories from this collection. I'm very much a fan of the American short story writer, now no longer with us, John Cheever, who wrote a very good story about a father-son relationship called Reunion, about the last time an adult son saw this particular father. And in a way, this story is in a sort of homage to Cheever's story, only in the fact that it's a father-son story. It's called The Whale Watchers. The last time Tom ever saw his father, the humpbacks were migrating north from the Antarctic to spend the winter in warmer Queensland waters. Tom thought whale watching seemed a safe proposition. Otherwise, his father and Sonia were just self-consciously hanging around the house, exclaiming at the bird life and picking up magazines and putting them down again. The trouble with living on the north coast was that southerners felt bound to include you and your spare room in their holiday plans. Even in the case of his father and his bride, their honeymoon plans. Until he received the wedding invitation, Tom hadn't even known his father had a girlfriend. His father was a quantity surveyor, widowed not quite 2 years and hitting 60. Sonia was a divorced allergy product salesperson, 45-ish, Tom guessed. They'd met in Bali the year before while getting over their separate sorrows around the pool bar at the Oberoi. After 3 days in-house observation of the new couple, with 4 still to go, Tom found it hard to imagine his stepmother being depressed in Bali or anywhere else. Sonia was a vivacious and decorative person. Even her asthma and migraine hadn't kept her down for long, and she'd smiled through both attacks those first 2 days. The honeymoon was difficult for Tom to get his head around. He didn't know if he and Chloe should be trying to entertain the older couple or allowing them complete privacy. In their presence, he felt strangely impatient and crotchety, as if his and his father's ages and roles had been reversed. At breakfast, he feigned hostly heartiness, poured orange juice, and didn't know where to look, just as his father had behaved with him and his overnight girlfriends when he was 20. At night, he heard them murmuring as he was preparing for bed, but thankfully the spare room was at the far end of the house, and he was able to block out the possibility of any intimate noises with a series of closed doors. That side of things didn't bear thinking about. "I think they're cute," said Chloe. "He's not your parent," Tom replied. Anyway, his father and Sonia were just driving through on their way north to Port Douglas, heading for 2 weeks on the Great Barrier Reef, and presumably as much privacy as they wanted. Before whale watching, Tom suggested lunch at a beachside cafe, the Undertow. It was full of young backpackers sharing pasta in various accents, admiring their new tans, and repeatedly counting out their money in heaps on the table. "Isn't this younger generation growing much taller than us oldies?" Sonia said loudly. "It doesn't matter which country they're from, even the Asians. They make me feel like a midget." "What nonsense," said Chloe. "What are you, 5'9"? 5'9.5", said Sonia. "The same as my hubby." She fondly patted his bald patch. "He's 5'8", said Tom, "unless he's grown since I was a boy." "Let's order, shall we?" his father said. He squinted at the name badge on the waitress's breast. He left his glasses behind. "What do you recommend, Stephanie?" "Shoshani," said the waitress. "It's all on the board. Calamari's off." Over lunch, Sonia loudly admired the artwork on the cafe walls, amateur representations of sunsets, dawns and rainbows over Mount Warning. Busily took note of the artists' names on a napkin and only nibbled at her prawn salad. Before Tom and Chloe had finished eating, his father already had his wallet out, waving away any opposition, but then landing in a credit card disagreement. As Shoshani kept saying, the cafe accepted only Visa and MasterCard. "Shoe shine? I must say I find that unacceptable," said his father, waving his platinum Amex. "Is there anyone in authority I can speak to?" Sipping the dregs of her mango smoothie, Chloe had a coughing fit then, and she and Tom avoided each other's eyes. Tom ended up settling in cash. His father was still seething when they reached the Cape, and Tom parked the car. They hiked along the steep coastal path to a cliff below the lighthouse. His father and Sonia deliberately fell behind, and when they caught up, his father's mouth was drawn tight and he was breathing heavily through his nose to cover his puffing. He looked a little flushed around the gills. Tom dimly remembered some paternal health warning sign 4 or 5 years before. His mother had insisted on dietary, tobacco and alcohol changes. No one had dreamt she'd go first. Chloe and he waited until the older couple caught up. Sonia had her arm hooked in his father's. Outdoors, with her flying blonded hair and pink cheeks, she suddenly looked years younger, buoyant and allergy-free, and surprisingly at ease in the elements. Southerly winds whipped the tussocky grass, buffeted their faces and made everyone's eyes water. The surly Pacific lurched and rolled towards South America and crashed on the rocks below. In the distance, a lone feral goat flicked into sight, skittered improbably up the cliff face and disappeared, a mere blink later, before Tom could point it out. He inhaled the misty wind, exhaled, inhaled again, and sighed, less deeply this time. "OK," he thought. He touched his father's shoulder. "What about this, Dad?" he said. "Impressive or what?" "Most easterly point in Australia," his father read from a sign. His eyes sought another sign. "Do not climb on the railings," he read aloud. "Parents, watch your children." "Darling, keep a lookout for whales," said Sonia. "I am. I can't see any," his father said. "You've got to keep looking," Chloe said. "Look towards the south. Suddenly one pops up unexpectedly. You'll see it breaching or blowing." "Possible rock falls. Keep inside the railings," his father read out in a louder voice. "As if you wouldn't," he scoffed, "if you had a modicum of bloody sense." Tom told them to watch out for the rare white humpback known as Migaloo that appeared off the coast every year. Wouldn't you think he'd be called Moby Dick? He muttered into the wind, to no one in particular. Who'd go outside the railings anyway, his father said. Only the Jap tourists taking their bloody snaps. You'd be asking for trouble. Slippage, rock falls. He gripped a nearby railing and attempted to shake it. It moved perhaps a millimetre. None of this looks too stable if you want my professional opinion. Why would you name a whale after a restaurant? Mused Sonia. She beamed. Just asking. Have you been to Moby Dick's? Nice seafood, but fairly pricey. His father was shaking his head in wonderment. Wouldn't you think some bright spark would have cottoned on to printing the signs in Japanese? They all huddled together on the cliff as the southerly gusted into their faces. For a long moment no one spoke. Brrr, shivered Sonia. Come on, you whales, she called brightly, like a soccer mother urging on her child's team. She jogged on the spot for a moment to get warm, then reached out and smoothed Tom's wind-ruffled hair with both hands. She patted his shoulder. There you go, stepson. Thank you, wicked stepmother, he said. Better keep your eyes on the sea or we'll miss them, said Chloe. When you two have finished larking about, we might get on with the business at hand, his father said, pointing at a foamy chasm below. I saw something big just then and you two missed it. They don't come that close into shore, Tom said. Probably a dolphin, said Chloe. This is a popular spot for dolphins. I saw a dorsal fin. Could be a shark, his father said. It'd make it worthwhile if it was a shark. Sonia asked then, Darling, did you look like Tom when you were young, dark-haired and wiry? What? I don't know, probably. He frowned and jerked his coat collar around his chin. Yes, I did, back when I was 6'2". Why do you ask? Just wondering. They're very alike, Chloe said, your chap and mine. Mum always used to say that, said Tom. His father pulled his collar higher against the wind. His jacket looked new, a fashion choice for a younger, hipper, perhaps bigger man. The shoulders slightly overhung his own. I think we'd better head off a bit earlier than we thought, he said. We'll make tracks and hit the highway this afternoon. I'd like to make Brisbane before tonight. Sonia looked surprised. He doesn't like driving at night anymore, she said. Look, said Tom, suddenly pointing out into the bay. There's a whale. There's whales where we're going, said his father. Now, I'm not sure how we're going for time. Want to allow time for questions, or I can read another story. Is that happy? This is the title story called The Rip. Now, it ends reasonably suddenly. The trouble with reading stories is that when you're reading them out aloud, when you're reading them yourself, you can see when you're getting to the end. When you're being read to, it suddenly comes sharply and you think, no, what was that? So perhaps I should wave my arms or something when I'm getting towards it. Anyway, it's called The Rip. The afternoon after the shark attack, a Saturday in early autumn, a father named John Bingham and his young daughter Sophie were strolling south along the Indian Ocean shore. Smoke from an inland bushfire met a humid mist rolling in from the ocean in a haze of muted light across the beach. In the low snapping waves, seashells rattled and chinked like coins. The shells attracted the girl's attention, and when she saw a small beach jellyfish amongst them, so perfectly round it could have been drawn with a compass, she gingerly prodded it with a toe. It was like a translucent saucer from a toy tea set, the tentacles retracted and harmless. Will it sting me? She asked. It's okay, her father said, picking up the jellyfish and placing it in her hand. Just to make sure, Sophie held it at arm's length, and the pink of her palm showed through the jellyfish in a diffused way her father found endearing. He hadn't mentioned the shark. Sophie was only 5, and since the separation, she stored up worrying things in her mind. Although the television crews in their helicopters had come and gone 30 hours before, people still gathered near the point break where the surfer had been pulled from his board. Most of them looked like tourists, their beachwear more seriously casual, their manners louder and edgier than those of the usual whale watchers or deadpan local surfers. A few lone beachgoers stood motionlessly on the headland, as silently expectant as voyeurs. Others hovered noisily on the sand, frowning and chattering, adjusting the brims of their caps and straw hats in the breeze, pointing out to the glassy swells, testing the water temperature, tasting the salt on their lips and inhaling the ozone as if these actions could help them commit this place and incident to memory and future anecdote. How the sightseers wished at this moment for a dorsal fin to slice through the water and satisfactorily cap their mood. Even a humdrum dolphin would be better than nothing. Their imaginations pictured ferocious creatures seething beneath the surface, but the only visible sign of marine life was a flock of crested terns rising into the mist and spearing into the slate-coloured sea over and over. The tern's relentless diving signified a shoal of surface baitfish, thought Bingham, and the baitfish meant bigger fish nearby. Many of the people on the beach had come to the same food chain conclusion. Amid the pointing and murmuring, some of the women shuddered dramatically and unconvincingly, their eyes darting around guiltily in case their enjoyment was too apparent. A couple of teenage boys cackled self-consciously and threw sand and pushed and tripped each other. In several family groups, you could make out 3 generations with similar hair colour and body shapes, the same nervous laughs. One large matronly-looking woman was even acting the news hound, wading ankle-deep into the ocean, even though fully dressed, while a man on shore, presumably her husband, filmed her describing the attack of the day before. As if she were on the 6 p.m. news, the woman was delivering a commentary while she gestured out to sea to indicate the tragic point of contact. A rip was running south near the point. Here there were occasional submerged rocks and muddy corrugations, and once or twice the woman stumbled in the small waves. But urged on by the man with the camcorder, she gamely pressed on. A bigger wave broke against her thighs, and then another. Perhaps getting soaked added to the desired intrepid effect, because encouraged by the cameraman and despite her drenched clothes, she adjusted her skirt and continued. Giggling, Sophie flipped the jellyfish at her father. He threw it back, and they made a game of tossing it back and forth. When the jellyfish broke into pieces, she fearlessly picked up another, and the battle went on until they reached the point and turned back along the beach. But even as they were skylarking, Bingham was thinking how malign the ocean looked, more so than he'd ever seen it. Those gunmetal clouds, now streaked with parrot-coloured flashes of sunset, appeared unnaturally ominous. Sentiment bubbled to the surface so easily since the breakup. Suddenly his daughter's existence had never seemed more precarious, their relationship more precious, his love for her more intense. Before the split, the family had swum and played at this beach all the time. On many gentle summer days, she had bobbed in this same parallel tide, teasing him with stabs of fright as her fingers deliberately slipped free of his grasp, his grip, as in a nightmare, still slick from applying her sunscreen. And she allowed herself to be swept up by the rip. This was nightmare material, sweeping along the coast and dragged out to sea. Sophie was a reckless little cork. "Oh no," he'd cry, sharing the delicious mock fear for perhaps 5 seconds, until he'd grab her up, unable to bear it any longer. Now he and Sophie came here only on her visiting weekends. The old familiarity had turned into novelty. Yesterday's was the 4th beach tragedy this season. The first couple of deaths, simple drownings, hadn't really registered in Bingham's mind, but in March a Japanese tourist had been caught in a rip and swept out. He remembered this one because of the unsuccessful 2-day helicopter search, and a week later a human femur had washed up in Fraser's Creek, half an hour north. Suddenly his imagination was uncomfortably vivid. The unnatural green and bronze sunset, the perpetual threat of nature, and the abruptness of savage chance engulfed the beach in a sombre mood, isolating them from the normality of the coast road traffic and the bland suburban roofs of the hinterland. The sea had turned sepia. Dusk enhanced the crack of the waves and the aggressive clatter of shells on the sand. Even the hazy air was odd, as if they were peering through smeared glass. The horizon had vanished, and it was hard to tell if they were breathing sea mist or bushfire smoke. Bingham was clutching his daughter's hand when they passed the home movie makers again. The man with the camcorder was becoming frustrated trying to position the woman correctly. At the same time, he was urging more reportorial emotion from her, a louder voice, more expansive gestures, while she was hard-pressed trying to hear his directions and keep her balance in the current. Now she looked self-conscious as her clothes clung revealingly to her bulky body and the rip kept snatching at her legs and shuffling her sideways out of frame. The cameraman was becoming exasperated. "Beverly, for Christ's sake, all you have to do is stand still for 10 seconds and point to where the shark got him." Sophie snatched her father's hand. "Shark? What shark?" The woman stumbled again just then, exclaimed an embarrassed little "ooh," and sat down in the sea. As her skirt billowed around her, she began sailing south in the rip. Both she and her husband looked mystified at this sudden turn of events. The man kept peering at his camera and then back at her. Meanwhile, she continued to sail south. He walked, then trotted a few steps along the shore after her. Then he seemed to reconsider, slowed down and began shooting this new action. The woman was picking up pace in the current. Sophie gripped her father's hand. "Is the lady all right?" The woman was beginning to panic, but her husband remained strangely phlegmatic and indecisive. He'd stopped following her along the beach and was still peering through the lens. "OK, stand up, Beverly," he called. He sounded irritated. "You better stand up." Bingham kicked off his shoes and moved towards the water. "No!" Sophie screamed and threw herself at his legs. "Don't go in there." "I have to," he said. "It's OK, darling, it's not deep." He prized off her fingers, but she followed him sobbing towards the ocean. He had to grab her by the shoulders and sit her down on the sand. "Don't move," he said. "Don't you dare move." His sudden fierceness was overwhelming, and as he left her on the sand, she was shrieking. The two men entered the water together, Bingham heading for the floating woman, while the husband followed him, holding the camera above his head to avoid the waves. At that moment, the current tumbled the woman to a flat sandbank, where, after a couple of attempts, she struggled to her feet. Smoothing down her clothes as best she could, she managed to defy the tide long enough to stagger towards the shore. "Yes," called her husband triumphantly, as if he were responsible for this sudden helpful turn in topography and tides. "Keep coming in this direction." He was filming her again. As he did so, he recorded his voice saying, "And here's intrepid Beverly after her big adventure." As she got to shore, the woman didn't say anything, beyond angrily dashing her hair out of her eyes. Then as she splashed up to him, she struck the camera from his hand into the sea. As Bingham waded ashore, he could just make out his daughter standing stiffly on the beach, a small shadowy stick figure. She was silent now. He tried to draw her to him, but he was soaked and dripping. Sophie pulled away then and ran up the beach towards the dunes. She sprinted as if from great danger, the sand squeaking sharply under her racing feet. He reasoned she was running to their car. He wasn't too worried. "Sophie," he called after her, "stop." But she kept on, reached the dunes, clambered up the slope and disappeared over the top. He began running too now, jogging in her footprints, irritated with her, but in his soggy clothes he had no chance of catching up. The dunes were soft, the sand too loose to retain her imprints, especially in the dim light, and surprisingly cold on his feet, cold enough to numb them. The cold spread up his wet limbs to his hips and stiffened his lower back. Eventually, he reached the top of the dunes. Where the sand merged into the loose gravel of the car park, thick coastal scrub, tea tree and tuart, grasped the hilltop, and in the trees' crowns, birds were squabbling and nesting for the night. Sophie was not at their car. The last few sightseers' cars were starting up, turning on their headlights into the haze and streaming into the highway traffic. The roots buttressing the trees reached out like fat fingers. Between the root fingers, some tourist litterers had carefully inserted their old drink bottles and ice cream sticks. Bingham spun around, circling the trees, the empty car park, the dank puddles around the change rooms and toilet block, his eyes searching. He heard himself calling her name and repeating into the last smoky streaks of sunset, "It's all right, nothing happened." Thank you. Phew. That story takes a bit more out of me than the others. Would anyone like to talk about any of the stories or life in general, the coast? Yeah.
You seem to use water and trees as a metaphor for a lifestyle or a life force that's typically Australian. Do you think that urbanization is going to or has changed that?
Very, very much so. I'm very interested in, since I wrote The Body Surfers 25 years ago now, it only seems about 5 years ago to me, there has been a definite change in the movement away from urbanisation. The whole sea change, tree change part of life has changed dramatically. In the past, certainly 25 years ago, people might have moved to the coast when they retired, when they were 65 and older. Now people are doing that. People are making a lifetime choice much earlier than they did a generation ago. And people are recreating themselves more than they did. I mean, when people retired a generation ago, they were the same people in a different place. They were a more casual version of themselves, but they were still the same, basically the same people, except they went fishing more and gardened more. Now, and I see this where I live in the hinterland of Byron Bay, you might get a 50-year-old instead of a 65-year-old, a 50-year-old merchant banker called Richard. A year later is a Frangipani painter called Zeus or Prometheus, with a 23-year-old girlfriend called Fantasia. Now, a generation ago, he would have been Zeus or Prometheus would have been with his wife, and similarly, you would get there weren't to the same extent women deciding that their boring city husbands they were over them, and they would travel north in their car and find a new life for themselves too. And the Beverleys and Margarets would have a more attractive, more fairyland type name, and would be Reiki specialists, or join the other 923 astrologers that we have there. So there's been a definite. There's all this is seriously in a way. All this is saying that people who are dissatisfied now don't hang about. They try and do something about it, I think. And I was interested in looking at that phenomenon in these stories. I mean, the whole essence of drama, whether it's a play or a movie or a novel or a short story, is conflict, of course. I mean, that's what drives everything. It drives everything artistic, I guess. So that is evident in these stories, but there's also, I hope, humour in them too. Because I don't know. One thing Australians have going for them is mostly those with a surname, anyway. Don't take themselves too seriously, and I'm all for that. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. Well, by definition, it's a much more drawn-out process with a novel, and a novel's sort of like a film. You know, it has a lot of characters, has a lot of scenes, and eventually, I mean, it's a three-act. A novel is a three-act play, you know, shaped like a W. A journey. The hero has a journey. Something goes wrong. Something happens that's interesting. It goes wrong again, and then it comes life affirmative at the end. Whereas a short story is more straightforward. A short story is sort of like a powerful anecdote, as if you're telling. I like to think of it as if I'm describing something to someone. You know, they say what happened, and I'm telling them in as entertaining a way as I can. That's much more. Apart from its stronger focus, the short story, as I said, I think before, it speaks to us in a personal way. You can read a novel in quite a detached way. You can enjoy it, but it doesn't involve you quite as much as a short story that works. And Hemingway used to say that he could tell us if a story worked if you could see a novel within it. So even if it was only 700 words long, if you could see a kernel of a novel inside that, then that was really the test. I think the short story deserves more. Short stories generally deserve a better press. I know that this book's had some really terrific reviews, and other books of short stories too. It is always the main feature story is always the latest novel in the literary pages, or the latest non-fiction book, even more so. And the short story is too often seen as some sort of quaint, tacked-on sort of book. I mean, maybe the only thing will get the short story some notice is a major literary controversy or something. That seems to work with to draw it to public attention. But we should call a press conference and confess that the stories never actually happened, that we made them up. Because every interview I've ever done, it's always presumed. People sort of look at you, okay. When did that happen to you? But the whole point is that you want to make it seem as if it happened. And that's the whole essence of the whole thing.
I'm interested why the first story is the lap pool. I really enjoyed that. But I kind of thought it wouldn't be the first one. I thought something like the Rip would be the first one.
Yes, I wanted to sort of bookend the book with stories that have something in common in a way, which is the lap pool, the first one, and the last story, the life alignment of the coffee grower. I always knew they were going to be the first and last stories, perhaps, and the Rip. Well, it's the way I juggled them around and wanted to. Without giving too much away, the first and the last stories both feature a snake as a symbol for things. And the first story is in a way a sort of rereading of the Garden of Eden sort of myth, Adam and Eve, except Adam is a bit disgraced. Eve is fine, but Adam's a bit disgraced in the story. Well, thank you.